Say all that stuff again.
All right, I have totally turned on the mic before I started my session, and you missed nothing. And yeah, I work there. It's Calamuna agency in Oakland, California. I'm an architect, which just means I try to get the other people to do as much of my work as possible. And if I'm writing code, it's usually fun, but it usually means like we're over budget and something's not going well, because I write great code, but as certain people can attest, sometimes I get a little lost in the weeds. Yeah, it's Calamuna. We did this fun little thing at Bad Camp where instead of giving out swag, we passed out donation cards, $5 donation cards, and you get to pick one of like a billion charities to donate it to. And we're hiring, so come be awesome. Yeah, come work with us doing front end and back end. We've got two spots open, so yeah. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? We'll talk about Composer. Just some of the basics of using Composer. We'll talk about the Drupal project and the different ways of getting the project, your Drupal project started with Composer. And we'll talk about how you can use it to become more awesome and customize your start state and make something that really works well for you, really makes it easy for you to spin up sites and to develop your project. Okay, so let's start with some Composer basics. So how do we get started? Why is it like not full screen? It's weird. It's like shrunk to smaller. Can y'all see that okay? I'm trying to make it bigger. That does nothing.
Is there a remote for the projector?
I mean, it's like, but even on my screen, it's like, it's like not
That's-
using the full.
On the left-hand side, is there a toolbar you can pull up? Yeah, bring that up. And then at the bottom, there should be an option to full screen it.
There you go, baby.
Scale up to fill window. I guess it's technically filling the window, it just doesn't look like it.
That's way too much. No, it's
Hey, stop that.
Sweet, perfect.
Okay, cool. Whatever. All right, it's not like tiny. You don't get the idea. So, what page is this? Drupal core. So how do you get Drupal core? You can click that button and download it. Don't click that button. Why? Because that includes all the Composer dependencies and everything already bundled up into it, which you don't want to do. There are two ways to get started with. Well, technically three, but the two ways to get started with the Drupal project repo. First of all, who doesn't know what the actual Drupal-project is? Okay, yeah, let's start there with basics. What is Drupal-project? Drupal-project is one of a few ways that you can get started with your Drupal site. And it is we'll look at the code in a minute, but it's a repository on GitHub and packages that. What are you doing? Okay, that lets you. It's a sort of best practice standard for managing your site with Composer. So there are two ways to get that code from GitHub. You can either go to GitHub and just clone it directly, which I'm a fan of. Composer create project. What does Composer create project do? Anybody actually know what that technically does?
Creates a project.
Hey! Smart ass. All it does is the same exact thing as going to GitHub and clicking the download tarball or download zip file button. That's all that does. Is it gives you the code base without the actual, Git repository attached to it. So it doesn't really matter if you know how to manipulate your remotes, or if you know how to delete the .git directory. It's the same thing as just cloning it. So, oh, sorry, wrong button. Okay, I said there was another way you could do it, and if you look at some of the documentation on Drupal.org, which is like highly difficult to navigate and find, but it will mention something called Drupal. This is also a repository on GitHub and Packages, which is the Composer version of all the repositories. And what it does is downloads Drupal core without the dependencies, right? So it's still better than going here and clicking the, oh my goodness. It's still better than going here and clicking the download Drupal core button, because at least it doesn't come with the dependencies. However, you're still, in order to move forward, you're still going to have to commit all of Drupal core's files to your repository. There's no way around that if you go this approach. And for me personally, I don't want to be committing code to my repository. That isn't mine, right? That's the whole idea of Composer in the first place. So just say no to that. And so let's actually dive in and take a look now at the composer.json of the Drupal project. Okay, so this is once this is the Drupal project repository. Once you've got the code, you'll have all of these files inside of it. Okay, this is what you'll get. And the important one here is this composer.json, right? So this is where all the magic happens and all the configuration is specified. So let's go through this a little bit and talk about some of the highlights. Okay, so let's talk about first adding modules. How are we going to add a module to this project? Well, most of you probably know you use composer require. Same thing if you're adding modules via NPM or adding projects via NPM or anything like that. You're going to be using the command line to add these to your project. And yes?
So really quick for the people who haven't used Composer that raised their hand, that's just typing that on the command line, right? Composer, require, and then...
Correct, yeah. Composer, require, and then project name, right? So and if you're familiar with using Drush, you might just use Drush download, redirect module or whatever. With Composer, you have to prefix that with Drupal/module name. Now, in order for Composer to know what Drupal means, right, that Drupal before the module name, you have to add the Drupal a repository to your repository's configuration. Okay, so that's what that does. Going down a little further, you can see we've got these require statements. When you Composer require something, it adds it here. This is the name of the package, followed by the version name, and then require dev. Does anyone know what require dev does?
Makes it so that the dev requirements are installed.
Who said that? Oh, yes, yeah. It kind of does nothing, actually. When you're talking about a root level project, it still installs these, just the same way it installs these. So I was a little bit confused by that at first. But if you just want Composer install, it's going to install the require devs as well. The difference is when it comes to requiring other packages, right? So if I'm requiring the Drupal Finder project right here, or Drush is a better example, to work on Drush with a whole bunch of other projects that I'm going to need, they list their dependencies in their own require dev. And when I require Drush, it's going to ignore those. It's not going to worry about installing those require dev dependencies because I'm not developing Drush. I'm developing my project. Okay. Now, what you can do is when you install this on production or in your testing environment, you can run composer install --no dev, and that leaves out the composer dev dependency.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How does this work with multi-site? You want to install modules with multi-site?
That's a good question. We'll get to where the modules get downloaded, but let's jump ahead real quick to this extras. So you can see here that we've got the Drupal module projects being downloaded into the web modules contrib folder. So if you want to put your contrib modules inside of like a sites directory, I don't know how to do that. Well, you could. We'll get into some extra configuration. I could probably figure out, you can ask me afterwards and we can try and figure out something. But if you're using a multi-site and all your modules just live in the standard place, there's no difference. It just works the same. But if you wanted to have per site dependencies, that you have to get a little more clever. We list a conflict with Drupal because if you're installing Drupal, then you're doing something wrong. So don't let people do that. We'll talk about minimum stability and prefer stable in a minute. Okay, now these versions on these packages here. Does anyone know what you call this type of versioning system that we see right there? Semantic versioning, aka Semver. Very good. Now, does Drupal 8 follow semantic versioning?
Yes.
Sort of.
Halfway.
Yeah. The difference is that well, you're right that Drupal core does. Right? Drupal core totally follows. But if you start looking at the modules, and this one doesn't have any modules in it, let's cheat and jump over here to my public zone. So, admin toolbar, version 1.18. And was anyone still working with Drupal 1? Anyone? No? Oh, okay. All right. So, yeah. So, the actual version that should be 8.1.18. Drupal modules, what they do in the Drupal Composer repository is we just disallow the last semantic versioning dot. So semantic versioning goes major, minor, patch. And in Drupal, major is always 8. So we only get minor and patch. And so it's kind of just like a little translation that we have to do when working with Drupal modules. Okay, semantic versioning. Check. Minimum stability. I'm going to plug something really quick. If you want to learn about minimum stability and how to get alpha and beta and dev versions of modules, read this fantastic blog post by, who is this by? Oh, yeah, this guy. I'm going by my pseudonym here. I'm kind of flying under the radar, Kalamuna. But, yeah, this is something that I wrote up a few months back because I got really confused about how to get access to the dev version of a Drupal module because it all works slightly differently than you might be used to with Drush. All right, so on my projects, I like to specify a minimum stability of dev and a preferred stable of true. Now I'll go into in the blog post. I go into some of the more details about why I prefer that. But this, to me, is the best combination of both security and ease of use. So you have to very specifically tell it that you want to use a dev version, but it will allow you to do so. And by default, it's not going to grab the dev version. It's going to try and find a more stable one. So, let's see, anything else in there? Libraries, scripts, and extra config. All right. Let's back up for a minute and just look at some of the other options in this composer.json. So we've got a scripts directory, a scripts setting and an extra setting. Inside of scripts, you'll notice all this stuff related to Drupal Scaffold. Anyone know what Drupal Scaffold does? It's a tool that's part of this Drupal project's repository. It's like a sister project that allows us to not have to commit any of the core files into our repository. So if you look at Drupal core by itself, you've got an index.php, a robots.txt, a whole bunch of files, and then you've got the core directory, the modules directory, the themes directory. Now, Composer by default only works at the level of directories, right? So if I say I want to download this specific package, I can tell Composer to put it in a different place, but it always puts it inside of its own directory. In the case of Drupal core, we need some of the files in the web directory. So if we look back at, so we need some of the Drupal core files to live here inside of this top level directory, and then we need some of the other files to live inside of the core directory. So Drupal scaffolding is just basically a sort of hacky workaround that grabs the index.php and some of the other top level root files puts them in the web directory, and then puts the core directory into the right place. All right. What else can you do with scripts? With scripts, you can do other fun things like write your own. So you can, just like you have with NPM, you've got like a test command that builds your project and runs tests. You can do the same thing with Composer. You can have it run PHP code sniffer, lint your code, and then if you happen to be awesome and write tests, you can have it call those. And then you can also have it run your front end build process as well. So very, very handy. And let's move on now to the extra configuration. And now this is my personal override of composer.json. The standard one is a little bit simpler, so we'll start there. Yeah, Derek.
Do you go over any other NPM stuff after this?
No.
Quick question then.
Yeah.
Can you use Composer to handle versioning, or is it just like you should use MVM?
To handle versioning of
Node versioning?
No, not that I'm aware of. That's a good point. I mean, I imagine you could, in the scripts, you could probably like call an NVM command to set the right.
Which is what we do. I was just wondering if there was a more elegant way with Composer.
You might be able to just like put the entire NVM script. You know how NVM is just like this weird little like script. You could just put that inside of your own Composer thing. That way, people don't have to install it themselves.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Good question. Okay, so how does Composer know where to put projects? Where does Composer put projects by default? Inside the vendor directory. Yeah, so by default, if you just say Composer require some random package and there's no other settings attached to it, it puts it inside of your vendor directory. So that doesn't work for our modules, our themes, all that kind of stuff. So there's this other fun little project called Composer Installers. And Composer Library Installer allows you to specify a type of project and then the associated directory where you want to where it places it. So it has an official list of allowed types, allowed project types, and you'll see here under Drupal we've got Drupal core, module, theme, library, profile, and brush, which is awesome. That covers the majority of the use cases. However, there's also some times when you need to put something in a different location, and you don't have an official type to go off. Now, if you just put some random project in here, Drupal-foobar, it's going to just ignore it. It's not going to know what to do with it. So that's where this project comes in. The configure Composer Installers extender allows you to define your own project types and then specify the directory for them. So let's take a look at that. This configuration right here, installer types, this is associated with the Composer Installers extender project. And so here I'm letting it know, hey, I'm going to define these extra types. So if you see any projects of this type, I want you to recognize them and put them where I tell you to. So down here, where it is, I'm not even specifying our asset and npm asset anyway. Oh yeah, here, yeah. So we've got the type of Drupal library which puts things inside the libraries directory. But there are some other projects out there that aren't specific to Drupal, right? So a really good one is the sortable.js library, which is used by the paragraphs module, if anyone's familiar with that, to allow you to move paragraphs between different paragraphs fields, which is kind of mind-blowing. But let's take a look at that. So here's this sortable.js project. Now that's used by lots of things other than Drupal. So if we look at its composer.json, its type is component. It's not Drupal library. right? So how could I get around this? Well, I could fork this repository to my own GitHub account, change its composer.json to be a type Drupal library, and then voila, it gets downloaded into the right place in my project, into the libraries directory. But then it's up to me to maintain that project. Whenever they make changes here, I've got to import those into my project, and I don't want to have to do that. So that's where it's nice to be able to specify your own types of projects and give it the correct location to put them. In this particular case of sortable.js, you'll notice it's inside of this components organization. This is a sort of collection of generic libraries, aka components. I don't know why they're called components, that are used by lots of different frameworks. And Rob Loach, I, and like a bunch of other people will take the official projects, fork them into the components organization, and then maintain these for you, right? Because the sortable.js, if you look at Rebaxa sortable, I opened a pull request on his on his repository to add a composer.json, but he never did, right? So when the maintainer is not willing to commit a composer.json, that's when we say, okay, well, we'll fork that into the components directory, add the composer.json, and then everyone can use it. Anyone who needs to pull in from Composer can do that there. Yeah.
If you don't need that metadata, couldn't you also add the GitHub repository?
Yes, thank you. That's I think I got ahead of my slides there. Hit the right button. I had a slide for that, and I lost it. But yes, there are two ways. Where did that slide go? Anyways, we'll probably come to it later. There are two ways to get access to a project that has no composer.json. So let's say there's some other random library out there that has no composer.json, and let's say it exists on GitHub, but it's not a very popular one. You don't want to be responsible for maintaining it. You don't want to have to go in and fork it and add a composer.json. Or maybe it's just some random little project that you're maintaining on GitHub. You don't necessarily have to add a composer.json to it. You can target it directly through this repositories section that we talked about before. Yeah. So this repositories area. All right. So we've got the one for Drupal, like we talked about. And we have another one here for the asset packages, which allows you to pull in Bower components. If you had another GitHub project that you wanted to pull in that wasn't available on packages, didn't have a composer.json, you can add this information here and require it down here, and basically you're telling Composer all the details it needs to go to that GitHub repository and pull it in. Thank you, Derek.
Do those details include credentials if it's not a public GitHub or other Git repo?
If it's not a public repo, then I think you have to set some environment variables maybe so that Composer connects with the right token.
Right.
If I remember correctly.
But it is in theory doable.
It is, yeah. And there's also like a private packages. You can run your own version of packages where you publish your private modules and packages to a separate packages instance that isn't like the public one. But yeah, good question. All right. Okay, so we talked about how to get libraries into your project in the right directory when they aren't of type Drupal project. Talked about the scripts and how and what the Drupal Scaffolding project is for, and how to write your own scripts, what they're useful for. Then we talked about the quote-unquote extra config, which is where you specify the installer paths and let's see, is there anything else in there that's useful? Yeah, that's That's mainly the useful stuff. Okay. Let's move on to the stuff that we already talked about. And this is the slide I was looking for. So when the code that you need only exists on GitHub, you can use the repository section of the composer.json, like we talked about, to tell Composer how to connect to it, or you can fork it and add your own composer.json. We've taken care of that work for you in a lot of cases in the components organization on GitHub. All right, so that's the kind of Composer primer. It's important, it's necessary, it's kind of boring, not super sexy, but now's where things get really fun. This is where you get to take this Drupal project and really make it your own, really craft it, really turn it into something that it makes development fun and easy and quick for you. All right, so there's a lot here. The very first thing that we'll talk about are the dot files inside of your project root. So if we look at, I'm going to be referring back to this Kalamuna/Drupal project. So this is a fork of the official Drupal project from Drupal Composer, and we periodically pull in any changes from them. But we get to maintain all of our sort of special things that, if they're important enough, we'll actually submit a pull request back to the parent repository because other people might want it. But in a lot of cases, this is stuff that is just particular to the way we like to do business. All right, so we have some overrides, first of all, in the git ignore file. I like to always ignore any .sql files, any gzips, so that way I can have my database dumps sitting in my root directory and I don't have to worry about accidentally committing them. Let's close these two. And you can do things like customize your git config, where we always want we never want to be versioning the permissions on the files, so we turn file mode off on all of our projects. And then we get to add these files that are particular to our hosting providers, right? So we often host with Platform and Pantheon, right? So we've got a pantheon.yaml, we've got a platform.app.yaml, and then when I fork this, or when I do a Composer Create project and get started on a particular client, wherever we're hosting, I keep that one and delete the other one, right? But at least they're both here as a starting point for me to use. I don't have to start from scratch every time. We have a particular front-end tooling set that we like to use. So we've got a package.json that has all of our requirements and our scripts and everything built into it. We use something called calistatic, which calls grunt and builds all of our front-end assets. So we don't have to do that stuff every single time. We have our continuous integration files in here. So circle, and I think we took out our Travis file because we're just not really using Travis at all. But whatever you're using for continuous integration, you can include that, and that way you don't have to be configuring that every time. For local development, we have a Docker Compose because some of our guys like to just roll with their own local development environments using Docker. We also have it's actually not committed to this version. I haven't backported it yet from our latest project, but I will be adding into this a .lando.yaml file, so that whenever we start a new project, we have a Lando configuration to start with. Same thing for, I'm not exactly sure how ddev works, but whatever your local development environment is, you can keep its settings right here. Okay, so it saves you time. Oh, and back in the day being like 6 months ago, when we were still using Vagrant and Drupal VM, I really held out as long as I could before switching to Docker. But this was a pretty sweet, extensive setup that we had that allowed us to have a really sweet environment spun up right off the bat. Let's see, anything else? And that's pretty much it. No, other things. The inside of the web directory, we customize settings.php. I'm very opinionated about settings files configuration, and so I've committed a generic set of settings files that work for almost all of our sites. So let's take a quick look at, let me close some of these. Yeah. All right, so let's take a look at the settings.php. So inside of websites default, we've got settings.php, and check out how clean and sexy that is. Right? This is the kind of clean shit you get to do when you're customizing your own start state, right? So if you've ever noticed when you're writing your code inside of settings.php, any variables you define, any functions you define, they become global, right? Because this isn't running inside, settings.php isn't running inside of a function or any other sort of code block. So all of those variables are available in the global scope, which is just not a big deal, but I'm a nerd and it just bugs me. And so I wrapped all of our settings configuration inside of an anonymous function, a self-calling anonymous function that simply passes into it all of the various arrays that are available in the global scope inside of settings.php. Right? So this is it explicitly declares these are all the variables that I'm going to use inside of my settings, and these are all provided by Drupal core as soon as we get to this space in the settings.php. Right, and then I have a common settings file that applies to all my development environments. Dev, a local, dev, test, live, and then I have a per environment settings file. And you can see that we're including it based on this environment variable. Where is that getting defined? Inside of common.php. And then finally, we test for the presence of a settings.local.php like normal and include that. So let's back up for a second. Oh my goodness, where is my settings.common.php and my settings.environment.php? Raise your hand if you've ever tried to pull in changes to your Git repo and Git gives you this really annoying error about being unable to unlink a file. Yes, exactly. That means that the file has become unwritable, and so Git is unable to replace it with the updated version, right? So the permissions on the file have changed, and you can no longer write to it. Drupal, by default, takes any file in here, or at least any settings files, and makes them non-writable for security reasons, right? It's a really good thing. However, that's a pain in the ass when you're trying to push version-controlled settings files around, because if I make some changes and I push it to the repo, my buddy goes to check it out, and Git's going to throw him an error. He's got to go and change the permissions on the directory, not only on the file, but on the whole directory, and then run it again. Meanwhile, he doesn't care what my changes were to settings.php. He just wants to get back to business of working on his own stuff. So what I do is I keep all of my settings files. Of course, they don't have any sensitive information in it. All of that is stored in environment variables. So no database configuration or anything like that. But I store them in the main sites directory. And so we've got the settings.common.php. This is how we define the environment. This is how we define it for Pantheon. If we were working on platform, we would use platform branch. If we were using Acquia, we use whatever Acquia environment variable. But the takeaway here is that the first thing you do inside of the settings.common is define what environment you're in. Figure that out based on environment variables or whatever it is that's specific to your hosting. And then what follows is just a few things about configuration that apply to all environments. Our configuration management directory is always going to be in the same place. Our private settings files, our configuration split settings, that we always want to turn off by default and then just turn them on in the individual environment files, and our site hash. Okay. Now let's look at settings.dev.php. So this is for all dev environments, and also typically this gets applied to all of our local environments. So this has all your fun, fancy, stuff to turn off caching and turn on certain configuration settings that apply only to some development modules. So all this stuff is normally things that I have to do every time I spin up a new site, right? Install the devel module, configure the devel module's menu, turn on the admin menu toolbar, all that kind of stuff. Some of that's handled inside of composer.json just by turning on the modules, but then sometimes they require extra configuration, like stage file proxy, right? We don't want to be pushing our files directories between environments, it's a pain in the ass. We turn on stage file proxy, we update this variable right there, and boom, all of our development environments start pulling their missing files from production, or whatever we want. All right. This is a really nice, important one if you've ever been working in Drupal and tried to use DPM or KSM or whatever to dump out some variables and your site errors out or runs out of memory. This is the culprit right here. You need to tell Kit not to dump out every single layer of the object array that you're in, because you will run out of memory. And then finally, if no database settings have been set yet, then we just specify a default set that works on Lando sites, or these are settings that really could work on a lot of different environments depending on how they're set up. And then this is just something extra I like to throw in there. It rarely ever gets called, but just a little bit of extra debugging in my development environments. So this is all stuff, like I said, I'm very particular and opinionated about my settings files. I want them set up the right way, and boom, this lets me do it once and come in, start a new site, just come in, tweak a few different variables in here, and we're off to the races. The other nice thing to configure is your development.services.yaml. We don't want to have to be doing that every single time. Development.services, we turn off we turn on debug cacheability headers, so we can, if we're trying to figure out the cacheability of our pages. We turn on twig debugging, auto reloading, turn off caching, and then we replace the cache class with a null cache class. So, and then I've also included a README here that kind of talks about how these site-specific settings files get included for any of our client developers who come in later and it's like, what's going on here? This tries to give a little bit of primer and explanation. This is an open source project. You're more than welcome to look at it, fork it, use it, whatever. All of it's pretty generic. None of it's the only very specific things that we'll look at is I think we've covered all of this. Yeah, so the only very specific things that we do to this project is this one little dependency inside of composer.json called cala-config. All right, now this is where we start to get a little bit opinionated, a little bit more opinionated about the initial setup of the site. And we'll look at that cala-config repository in a minute. But that's a custom module that isn't published to Drupal.org because it's so specific to our needs. It's just published to packages, and we'll look at what that does in a minute. Before we get there, let's back up and look at, let's look at configuration exports. Okay, one of the projects that I always like to include on my sites, especially really useful early on in development, when we might not have a sort of upstream environment like a develop or a test environment to work from, and we're just all working locally, is this Yeah, there it is, config installer. So the config, does anyone know what the config installer project is? Yeah.
Doesn't it, you can build a new site from an exported config?
Exactly, right. So when I run, hopefully everyone has here's a basic idea of what I mean when I say configuration management and exporting your configuration. So when I export the configuration, it lives inside of my configuration sync directory. I can commit that configuration to the repository, and then developer B will then pull in my changes, have all of those configuration files, and he can actually run a site install, right? So a normal Drupal site installation that starts off with the, I think it uses like the standard or maybe the minimal installation profile by default, and then imports automatically all of that configuration that I've already set up for my site. So I can go in, I can, the very first time through, install with the standard site installation profile, make any customizations that I want, add content types, whatever. Meanwhile, developer B, who doesn't have access to a database dump, can still get started and have all the exact, he can have the exact same site that I have, minus content. Right? So with the configuration installer profile, you get every single thing that's on the site except for content and files. Right? So this really simplifies the need to push database dumps around. It's still important when you get later on in the development process, you actually have real content that you need to be testing with, but early on, all you really need is the configuration. The content is all just dummy lorem ipsum testing stuff. So yeah, it's a really, really handy project.
Derek, have you seen the core patch that does kind of the same thing?
I just, when I was making the presentation today, I just saw there's something about a patch that was allowing that.
We've started using the patch because it's a little easier.
Awesome.
Config installer still kind of workaround thing that's not as elegant. Core patch is pretty nice. I think it's going to get committed at some point. I don't think it's been committed yet. There's still some back and forth on it, but it keeps getting bumped up to whatever the minor version is. So
yeah,
I think it's going to make it at some
So it's on
point.
8.6 right now?
I
patch is
haven't
applying
checked,
to 8.6?
but I know it's like at least 8.5 or whatever.
All right.
There's a lot of activity. Anyways, it's even a little bit cleaner than config installer. 'Cause
That's
we
great.
Use that.
I have run into, there are some quirks and some annoyances with configuration installer. It will error out in certain circumstances, and you kind of have to, massage it and sweet talk to it. So that's great to hear. And so forget about this project. Find the core patch.
Still fine.
Speaking of which, how do you apply patches to Drupal core? You have to download the patch, right? And then you have to commit it to your sites directory and use Git to use the patch command to patch it and all that, right?
No.
No! Yay! Composer to the rescue. Simplified. It's so much cleaner and sexier. Like, thank God for this. I feel like we're
Is
finding
that
it.
considered hacking core when you apply a patch that way?
No, it's not. You can hack core to your heart's delight as long as you turn it into a patch that's available on Drupal.org. You won't get the bad judgment module applied to your project. No, that's not entirely true. It's still hacking core, but because we're not committing those changes we're not committing core to the project, it's much more transparent. I know I can look at somebody else's project and know exactly what changes they've made to Drupal core, whereas before, I inherit some project where all the modules, all the core files are committed. Unless I sort of try to run some complicated git diff, I have no idea what they've modified. So this is really, really transparent. So you can specify patches directly in your composer.json, or you can specify an external file that holds all your patches. I don't know why, but we keep them in an external file. So we do have one core patch that I always include by default, and it's something that it's an error that I always get whenever I install, I think, the coffee module or something like that. I don't remember. I just remember I was getting this error with particular set of configuration and module soup that I was using, so I just threw it in here. It might even be committed to core now. I need to pull this out. I don't know. But so right now, what I'm going to go do later today is rip out the config installer dependency and add the core patch that Jay was just talking about. So it's available by default. The core patches, the patches syntax is description of the patch. followed by a colon and the path to the file. And Composer just downloads the patch and applies it as soon as you run Composer install. Very, very nice.
Do you use Devil Generate for your sample data after this process, or
I don't.
no?
Not very often.
There's a demo module for Drupal 8 that Stefan wrote that you guys
YAML
will maintain.
content? Yeah, we
YAML
like
content. That's also really awesome for that
Awesome.
type of stuff.
To get some sample content.
Yeah.
That's a great
Like
idea.
you could use Migrate to do effectively the same thing. I feel
Yeah.
like the YAML content is a little bit easier. But yeah,
Cool.
it's pretty nice. We like it.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, the YAML content. I
content.
think I read something about that. I'll check more into it.
Yeah. It's great for running tests too. Like if you have the hat or something like that running,
Yeah.
and you have a YAML content set up, you can just literally import thousands and thousands of variants of your content types. Anything your content authors can dream up.
Nice.
And just run those tests through them real quick.
Also, I bet at Red Hat you guys use the hell out of that.
Not yet.
Not
We
yet?
use the Drupal
Uh-huh.
7 stuff
Uh-huh.
mostly, but we do Drupal 8.
All right. All right. So this is actually a good segue. We're moving into the territory of what my friend Drupal Ninja calls using your site as a what is it? Using your site
Like as a platform.
as a platform. Yeah, using your site as a platform. By having, we can create your own Drupal distribution that has its own profile, has its own configuration files and everything already set up in it. This is kind of an in-between stage where we don't have our own installation profile because I don't want to be overriding what Core provides in the future with Drupal standard, and I've just opted for a slightly lighter route. How I get around that and still being able to add as much of the configuration as I want. We're doing on time. What time do we leave here?
3.
What now? All right. Let me just say this one thing real
We're
quick.
not
With
complaining.
We got till
We're not.
3:15.
That's right.
3:15.
Or till the next speaker kicks you out.
That's
So we
right.
can set up.
Okay. All right. Well, so rather than having my own installation profile, we have this little module I mentioned before called cala-config. Now, if we look inside of this config directory, we've got something called optional, config optional, which is, I recommend using optional instead of, there are different types of configuration. You can have install, optional, something else. But I recommend using optional. It's just a little more flexible. It works in different ways. So I imported a little bit of, as soon as this module gets turned on, it imports my config split settings. So I always want to have config split going on so I can have different configuration per environment. Right, so I get that out of, it's a pain in the ass to configure sometimes, and it can be kind of confusing. So this just, if one of my other developers who isn't as familiar with config split starts a new project, boom, he doesn't have to worry about it. It's there. Let's see, and then I list a bunch of requirements in the composer.json, so it pulls in all of my fun, sexy development modules. I always want to have the chosen module installed to make multi-selects not such a pain in the ass. Admin toolbar, browser sync, cache control. The first one is the chosen library. The second one here is the Drupal module. The coder module for code sniffing. Coffee module for shortcuts. Config direct save so you can export your configuration right to from the UI direct into your configuration sync file. Page provider's dependency for config split. Develop module, path auto, redirect, search kint. Search kint is so clutch. If you're not using search kint, it allows you to search within inside of the kint output for a specific name. Stage file proxy, twig debug. You can actually stop your debug inside of the twig file. Pretty sexy.
Have you gotten that to work?
What's that?
Have you gotten that to work?
Yeah.
I've never been able to get it to work.
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, that's a lie. I haven't, but my coworker Josh
Yes,
is.
it does
So.
work. That's good to know.
Yeah.
You have to turn cache off. Or turn it back on.
Really?
So if you're uncaching your twig files, you got to turn it back on because they have to be cached so that XDebug can see them like as a PHP.
Gotcha.
Oh.
Yeah.
Smart man. Thank you. It's nice being here. See, we can solve all those problems right here. Sean is working here together. Auto row text area to make text areas with a better UX. And then that extender module I talked about allows us to specify custom installer types. So one other thing I wanted to cover real quick, two things. One is when you want to generate this configuration that you want to be imported into your site from a module, you have to clean out you have to kind of sanitize the site-specific settings. And there are two settings that get exported into your configuration files by default that prevent it from being imported into another site. Those are the UUID of the configuration file itself, and then the site hash. And so each site has its own hash or UUID associated with it that gets stored in that file, and Drupal won't let you import it if those two are there. So you can use Drupal console to do a config export, -- remove UUID, -- remove config hash. And then they're nice and clean, and you can't use those inside of your site's config directory, but you can use them inside of your module's config directory to pass on to other sites. You can also use features. I don't know, I haven't actually used features the way it's meant to be used before, so just do this.
Don't bother.
And then finally, last thing to show you real quick is, the module does come with its own installation. Yeah, it comes with it. Every module has an install hook, and so what I do is I come in here and I clean things up. So like I said, I use the standard installation profile by default. I do not want the article content type. I do not want the shortcut module. I do not want any of these modules. In fact, ever. I never, ever, ever want the color module or comment or sometimes contact. And these are production settings. I then go on to override these settings lower down, but these are the settings that get exported into my site's config, right? So I turn off everything that I don't want on in my production environment. I don't want the tour module installed.
Why don't you use the minimal one and then just add the stuff that you want?
I thought about that, but I don't know.
The minimal
in case
doesn't turn
standard
anything
stuff
on, so
gets
just
added.
take from standard what you want, put in that if you're opposed to creating your own base install.
That's probably smarter, but whatever.
Just saying, because you're installing and then
And
uninstalling.
removing everything. I don't know. I do want the basic page content type. I like to
But
be.
you can copy all that stuff. Just copy it over.
But I don't want to be doing that. I'd rather remove than add, right? Because if they make changes in the future to the field name or something, body field name or something. And then this is what I really love. Then I actually export after I've configured things. I actually run my configuration exports right from this module. So with this setup, at the end of the day, what I do is I run. I'm not actually going to run the commands here, but I run drush site install, which installs the site with the standard profile by default, and then I run drush enable cala config, right? With those two commands, I end up with a completely fully functioning Drupal site that has the configuration, an initial set of site configuration already exported to the configuration sync directory. And then this is my favorite part. This module actually turns itself off because there's no need for it. All it does is it's present so that for its dependencies, so it turns on a bunch of dependencies. It exports the config, changes a few things, and then we don't need it anymore. Turn it off.
Self-destructs.
Yep. And it even captures this change inside of the configuration. So after it turns itself off, it runs another configuration export. And so core.extensions.yaml is up to date.
I think the next class is gathering at the door.
Okay. Any final questions?
That was awesome.
Hey, thanks guys.
Yeah, do you have a human generator?